She looked at me and said, "You always look at me like you know something." And maybe she was right, because from the moment I met her, I knew nothing between us would stay simple. "Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now?" I love seeing how far these stories travel. I hadn't been back to that house in years. My friend had moved out long ago, but the memories lingered like the faint smell of pine and rain that always clung to the old porch. That afternoon, I stopped by to drop something off, a borrowed book, nothing important, but the moment she opened the door, the air changed. It wasn't supposed to be her. I remembered her, of course. Everyone did. My friend's mother, Unji. Graceful in the quiet way some women are when they've lived enough life to no longer seek attention, yet still command it without trying. Her hair was shorter now, a deep chestnut instead of black, and time had carved faint lines near her eyes, but somehow, they only made her look wiser, softer. "Ah, it's you," she said, surprise melting into a smile. Her voice carried that warmth I'd forgotten, low, patient, and slightly teasing, as if she already knew what I was thinking. "Come in, it's been so long." The house felt smaller than I remembered. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the scent of brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen. Sunlight spilled through the curtains in slow golden ribbons, settling across her shoulders. She moved with quiet composure, and I caught myself following every motion, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbows, how her presence filled the silence without needing to speak. She asked about my work, about my parents. I answered politely, my voice steadier than I felt. There was something disarming about standing there in the same living room where I'd once watched her scold my friend for missing curfew. Back then, she'd been Mrs. Park. Now, she was just Unji in my mind, though I didn't dare say it aloud. While she poured tea, I noticed a framed photo on the sideboard, her family, years younger. Her husband in the back, hand on her shoulder, smiling a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She must have caught me looking, because when I turned back, she was watching me. Not suspiciously, not even curiously, just seeing me. Like she was reading a book she'd already finished once, and wanted to check if the ending had changed. Our eyes met and held for a beat too long. Something unspoken passed between us, familiarity mixed with a quiet recognition neither of us had words for. I looked away first, pretending to sip the tea that had already cooled. The conversation drifted to lighter things, the neighborhood, her garden, the weather that never seemed to decide between seasons. Yet under every word, there was a hum. A subtle awareness neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. When I finally stood to leave, she followed me to the door. "It's good seeing you again," she said softly. I smiled, unsure how much truth my expression gave away. And just before I stepped outside, I heard her voice, gentle, thoughtful. "You always look at people like you know something." Her words lingered long after the door closed. Maybe she was right. Or maybe, for the first time, I'd just been seen. I hadn't planned to stay long that day, but my friend called while I was there, running late, asking me to wait an hour or so. I remember the way she smiled when she overheard the call. "Then you'll have to keep me company," she said lightly, motioning toward the kitchen. It felt natural, somehow. Not like intruding, more like stepping back into a rhythm I hadn't realized I missed. She moved gracefully through the small space, pulling out teacups, setting them down with quiet precision. Every sound, the soft clink of porcelain, the whistle of the kettle, echoed in the warm hush of the afternoon. We talked, at first, about ordinary things. How the neighborhood had changed. How her son never visited enough. How she'd taken up gardening to fill the empty hours. Her words were calm, but I could sense the solitude underneath, like a faint echo behind every sentence. I found myself listening more closely than I usually do. Maybe it was her voice, low, steady, the kind that draws you in without trying. Or maybe it was the way she looked at me when I spoke, as though my thoughts actually mattered. When I asked if she ever missed the noise of a full house, she gave a small, wistful smile. "At first I did," she said, her gaze drifting to the window. "Now I miss it in quieter ways." The kind you don't talk about because no one would really understand. Her honesty caught me off guard. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The clock ticked steadily between our words. Outside, wind brushed through the trees. And in that stillness, I realized how rare it is to share silence with someone who doesn't rush to fill it. I tried to change the subject, but she must have noticed my glance. My eyes had lingered on her, longer than they should have. She turned back toward me, a faint, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "You always look at me like you know something," she said. Her tone was playful, but her eyes searched mine for an answer. I hesitated, trying to find something casual to say, but nothing fit. Because the truth was, I didn't know anything about her, yet I felt like I did. The kind of knowing that lives between familiarity and fascination. I finally said, "Maybe I just listened too closely." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "No. It's not that. You see people differently. It's unsettling." Her words lingered in the air, delicate but weighted. She looked away, pretending to fuss with the teacup, though I caught the faint color rising in her cheeks. Something shifted then, nothing dramatic, just the smallest thread of awareness stretching between us. When my friend finally arrived, the sound of the door breaking the quiet felt almost intrusive. I stood to leave, but as I did, she touched my wrist lightly, just for a moment. "It was nice talking," she said. "It's been a long time since conversation felt that easy." I left with her words still echoing in my chest, wondering what exactly she thought I knew, and why part of me wanted to find out. After that afternoon, it became a quiet pattern I never intended to start. Every few weeks, I'd find some reason to stop by, a book I'd borrowed, a question from my friend, an errand that didn't really need doing. She never questioned it. She'd just smile when she opened the door, as if she'd been expecting me all along. Sometimes her son was there, sometimes not. When he was, we'd talk easily, sports, work, old memories. But even then, I'd feel her presence somewhere in the background, the faint rhythm of her footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of her laughter from another room. And when he'd leave to take a call or run an errand, silence would fill the house like a held breath. It wasn't silence born of discomfort. It was heavier than that, the kind that hummed with things unspoken. She'd pour tea, or slice fruit, and I'd sit at the edge of the counter, pretending not to notice how close she was standing. Pretending not to feel how naturally our quiet began to align. One evening, rain began to fall while I was there. She turned on the small lamp in the corner, and the room glowed a deep amber. The soft patter against the windows made everything feel slower, gentler. She played music, old jazz, the kind that fills the spaces words can't reach. "I like nights like this," she said quietly, setting down 2 cups. "The world gets softer when it rains." Her voice held something that made me want to ask, softer or lonelier? But I didn't. Because we both knew the answer. We talked for a while about small things, the rain, the news, the scent of the garden after dark. But beneath each word, there was a steady current of awareness. I noticed how her hand lingered on the table when she spoke, how her eyes avoided mine only to return again a moment later. Every glance felt like the edge of a confession. Still, we never crossed that line. Maybe we were afraid of what might unravel if we did. Or maybe we both understood that the beauty of what we shared came from its restraint, from the discipline of staying right at the edge and never falling in. When I finally stood to leave, she followed me to the door as always. The rain had eased into a drizzle. She held the door slightly open, the soft light falling across her face. "Drive carefully," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, wanting to say something, anything, that would explain the quiet pull I felt toward her. But all I managed was a faint smile. As I walked to my car, I looked back once. She was still standing there, arms crossed lightly, watching the rain. I don't think she saw me. Or maybe she did, and that was the unspoken distance between us. It was one of those evenings that felt heavier than it should have, the kind where the air itself seems to hold a secret. The rain had been falling since noon, soft and persistent, like a memory that refused to fade. I stopped by her house again, No reason this time, no borrowed item to return. I told myself it was just to check on her, to make sure the leaks she'd mentioned last week hadn't worsened. But I think we both knew that wasn't why I was there. She opened the door in a light sweater, her hair slightly damp from the humidity. She looked surprised at first, then smiled, a tired, gentle smile that reached her eyes just enough to make me forget whatever excuse I'd rehearsed. "Come in," she said. "I was just making tea." The house felt softer that night. The lights were dim, the air warm with the scent of ginger and honey. Outside, the storm whispered against the windows. Inside, everything felt still. We sat at the small dining table, our cups untouched. For a long while, neither of us said much. And then, quietly, she spoke, her voice low and careful. "Do you ever feel like time moves faster when you're finally alone?" I looked at her, unsure what she meant. She smiled faintly, eyes on her hands. "When the house was full, I used to wish for silence. Now that I have it, I realize silence isn't peace. It's just the sound of being left behind." Her words settled deep in the space between us. There was no self-pity in them, only truth. The kind that comes when someone has carried loneliness long enough to stop hiding it. I didn't try to comfort her. I just listened. Maybe that was what she needed, not advice, not sympathy, just presence. After a moment, I said quietly, "You deserve to be seen, you know. Even in the quiet." She looked up then, her eyes glistening slightly from the light, or maybe something else. A small, shaky laugh escaped her. "Sometimes I think you see too much," she whispered. "It's dangerous." I smiled faintly. "I don't mean to." "I know," she said, pausing. "That's what makes it worse." Her words lingered like the soft echo of thunder outside. She reached for a napkin, but her hand brushed against mine. It wasn't deliberate. Just a moment, small, human, unplanned. Still, neither of us moved. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, with awareness, with care, with something that felt dangerously close to longing. Finally, she pulled her hand back and stood, her composure returning in pieces. "I should clean up," she said quietly, forcing a small smile. "The rain makes me sentimental." I nodded, pretending to agree, but the truth was simple, she hadn't been the only one. That night, I drove home with her voice echoing in my mind, her honesty, her laughter, and the unspoken confession that neither of us dared to name. It had been a few weeks since that night. We both pretended nothing had changed, but the truth lingered quietly between us, like the last note of a song that refused to fade. Every visit now carried a new kind of tension, not heavy, not awkward, but fragile, like glass that might break if touched too firmly. That evening, the sky was painted in soft gold. Late spring light spilled through the kitchen window, catching the faint steam rising from a pot of tea. She was standing by the counter, sleeves rolled just above her wrists, hair loosely pinned in a way that let a few strands fall against her neck. She looked peaceful, or maybe I wanted to believe that. "I made too much tea again," she said, half smiling. "You might as well help me finish it." I sat at the small table as she poured, her movements unhurried. The sound of tea streaming into the cup was almost musical. A quiet intimacy lived in every motion, the way she stirred, the way her eyes met mine and then drifted away. The room smelled faintly of citrus and jasmine. Outside, cicadas hummed. The moment felt ordinary, yet every detail pressed itself into memory, the warmth, the silence, the distance that kept thinning between us. She reached for the sugar jar, and as she leaned forward, the fabric of her sleeve slipped down her wrist. Instinct took over. I reached out, gently fixing it back into place. My fingers brushed her skin, soft, warm, alive. Neither of us moved. She froze for a heartbeat, eyes on my hand. Her breath caught, just slightly, enough for me to hear it. I should have let go. I know I should have. But something in that stillness held us both there, a fragile, suspended truth neither of us wanted to shatter. The air shifted. Time seemed to slow, folding itself into a silence that felt too full to hold. I could feel her pulse beneath my fingertips, steady yet trembling, as though she was trying to stay composed. Finally, she whispered, barely audible, more breath than sound. "This isn't right, is it?" I let my hand fall away slowly. "No," I said. "But it's honest." For a moment, she just looked at me, really looked, like she was memorizing something she couldn't keep. Her eyes were soft, almost apologetic, but behind them was something else, something she didn't have the words for. She exhaled, a long, trembling breath, and smiled, that quiet, familiar smile that always felt like a goodbye and a beginning at the same time. "Tea's getting cold," she murmured. And just like that, the moment passed. We spent the rest of the evening talking about everything except what had just happened. Yet every word, every glance, was marked by the memory of that single touch, a moment that didn't ask to be repeated, only remembered. When I left that night, I looked back once more through the kitchen window. She was still there, hands wrapped around her cup, eyes distant, as if she, too, was replaying the same moment. That night stayed with me, not because anything happened, but because for once, everything almost did. After that evening, everything between us began to change, not outwardly, but beneath the surface, where words never reached. We still saw each other now and then. Still exchanged the same polite smiles. Still drank tea at the same table. But something had shifted. It was in the way we avoided eye contact a second too long, in how our conversations began to circle safe topics, as if we were both afraid of falling back into that silence that once felt so close. She had built a small garden in the back, filled with white roses and lavender. I helped her move a few pots one afternoon, our hands brushing more times than they should. Each touch felt like a reminder, not of what we could be, but of what we'd already almost become. When she laughed, I noticed it more now, softer, more hesitant. As if she was careful not to let it reach too far. And when I left, she no longer followed me to the door. Instead, she'd linger in the kitchen, pretending to tidy up, her voice trailing off mid-sentence. I understood what she was doing. We both did. We were pulling back, slowly, deliberately, before something irreversible could happen. One evening, as the sky dimmed into pale violet, she asked if I'd stay for dinner. I almost said yes. But something in her tone, gentle, uncertain, told me this invitation wasn't about food. It was about goodbye. We sat outside, quiet, as the day folded into night. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the city lights shimmered in the distance. She rested her hands on the table, fingers intertwined, like she was holding on to her own resolve. "I think you should stop visiting for a while," she said softly. The words landed gently, but they hurt like truth always does. I didn't argue. Didn't ask why. I only nodded, because we both already knew. Not because she didn't want me there, but because she wanted to remember us this way, still innocent enough to remain beautiful. Her eyes glistened when she finally looked up. "You've been kind," she said. "And I'm grateful. But I don't trust myself to stay kind forever." I smiled faintly, not out of amusement, but understanding. "You don't have to explain." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I had to say it." For a moment, I thought she might reach out. She didn't. Instead, she folded her hands together and looked toward the garden, as if the sight of growing things could steady her heart. When I stood to leave, I wanted to tell her that some distances don't mean absence, they just mean love, redefined. But I said nothing. At the gate, I turned back once more. She was still sitting there, small against the evening light, her face calm but unreadable. Some goodbyes don't need words. They only need the courage to stay unspoken. Months passed. Seasons slipped through like soft pages turning, summer into autumn, autumn into something colder. Life, as it always does, rearranged itself around absence. I threw myself into work, into routines that didn't ask questions. Yet no matter how full my days became, a quiet part of me always lived in that small house with the white roses and lavender. I didn't see her again for a long time. Not because I couldn't, but because I respected the distance she'd asked for, and maybe because I feared what seeing her again might awaken. Some silences deserve to remain untouched, otherwise they lose their grace. Then one Sunday morning, fate, or coincidence, decided otherwise. I was sitting by the window of a quiet cafe downtown, reading the paper, when I saw her through the glass. Same calm poise, same careful stride. Her hair a little shorter now, her expression lighter, as if time had polished away the heaviness we once shared. She hadn't changed much, but something about her aura felt settled, peaceful. I stepped outside before I could talk myself out of it. When she noticed me, her surprise melted into that familiar, half-smile, warm, restrained, tinged with nostalgia. "Of all places," she said softly. I laughed, though my throat felt tight. "Seems the city hasn't run out of coincidences yet." We talked for a few minutes. About her son, who just moved abroad. About the weather that never stayed steady. About nothing and everything. The conversation flowed easily, too easily, maybe, as though our hearts had rehearsed it 100 times in silence. The cafe door chimed behind us. The world moved on, indifferent. Yet inside that small bubble of time, everything felt suspended again, the same quiet magic, older now, gentler, without the ache of wanting. When she stood to leave, she reached out, resting her hand lightly on my arm. "It's good to see you," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "You look well." Her touch lasted only a heartbeat, but it carried everything we'd never said: gratitude, affection, restraint, and something even deeper, forgiveness. I nodded. "You too." She hesitated, then smiled, that same knowing smile from the very beginning. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice again in my head. "You always look at me like you know something." And this time, I finally understood. It wasn't that I knew something about her. It was that I had recognized a part of myself in her, the longing to be seen, the fear of being misunderstood, the quiet courage it takes to love without demanding anything in return. She turned to leave, the sunlight catching the edge of her hair. I watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Some stories don't end. They just settle into memory, soft, unfinished, but whole in their own way. And sometimes, all that remains is a look. A look that says everything words were never brave enough to. If this story found a quiet place in you tonight, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and what part of their story stayed with you the most. Speech Balloon. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like more slow burn, age gap stories that feel real, stories that remind us how love doesn't always need to be loud to be unforgettable.